Fantastic. Perfect. Well, first of all, thanks to both of you for joining us today. We are excited about this topic. Focus groups is something sort of near and dear to my heart because, to be honest, they are one of the most powerful tools I find from an HR strategy perspective. When you do focus groups really well, they unlock the information you need to align your employee experience with your business strategies. And so they can be so helpful. One of the impetus for actually writing, though, this particular session actually came from a string of settings where I was talking to employers who had previously done focus groups, not with us, and not like somebody just sort of came along and did them. And they were sharing with us some of the negative experiences that had come out of that. And it either came from employees who were sharing, like, I don't want to do this again. I got burned last time, or coming from employers who felt like they didn't get what they were hoping for. And there are some key things that were really evident. So, like, here's why that might be happening. And so, what I'd love for us to spend time going through today is really spending time talking about how do you make these most effective, and some of the variations that we use along the way to really customize these based on the scenario and the situation that we're working with. I know I'm familiar with both of you, but just again, kind of as a reminder of who we are and what we do, I officially started People Solutions 9 years ago. So we are like 9 years and 3 weeks into this adventure. And we've been absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to work with small to mid-sized companies that are, needing the HR resources and support, and most importantly, expertise to kind of help take things to the next level to align your HR strategy with your business strategies. And we love working with employers and their people to help create environments that really make a huge difference. And this is just one of the many ways that we look to reach out as kind of your trusted advisor to share what are we hearing and what are we seeing from employers that we could help make the world a little bit of a better place, by sharing this kind of knowledge and experience. We are happy to do that. Diving into things today, like, why do people do focus groups? There are so many reasons to do a focus group. I will tell you, one of the things that, though, we often see when somebody says, let's do a focus group, is they aren't clear on what is the actual goal of the focus group. They're like, we'll just get feedback. The challenge with that is just getting feedback. You might get feedback all over the board, and then you don't have a way to, like, actually act on that feedback. And so it's super important that as you are going into focus groups, you think about, what do we want to get out of this and why are we doing this in the first place? And so, to the extent that you spend time getting that down, super important. So these are just a couple of examples of reasons that companies do focus groups, but there's plenty more along the way. I'll share some examples that we've done. First and foremost is gathering feedback for leaders. And this can be, we've done things sometimes where we need feedback for the entire leadership team. Other times it's, you know what, I have this leader and they're struggling. We have a client we just did some of this with the other day. They had a new leader who had been there about 6 months, brand new to the organization, was feeling like they came in and had to make a lot of changes. They knew they ruffled some feathers, but they cared about whether or not that created, like, are they off to a good start and a good setting? So sometimes it can be really specific to one individual leader. Other times you're trying to figure out, like, leader by leader, how are their teams feeling? And then also there's that version that's like, here's what leadership needs to know across the board. I'll give an example. We did that about 2 years ago for a client that was actually a larger client. They had probably 400 or 500 employees, and they were having lots of turnover. People were frustrated, and quite honestly, the HR person said, like, people are crabby and we need to figure out why. Like, everybody here is being crabby on a day-to-day basis. And so we took that and did a series of focus groups over several months to put together, here are the themes across all of the departments. What was interesting was they felt like employees were saying everything is wrong. And actually the employees were saying there's a lot right, but the things that are wrong are problematic consistently across all of the departments, and they should be easy to solve. And so we were able to find those trends and give them, here's ideas, like, here are the 5 things your people really care about. Everything else is just, like, yeah, I might make a comment about something once in a while, but that's not actually what's causing your problem. And so that kind of feedback about the leadership level can be important. The second piece is perceptions of processes and policies. So a lot of times we will do this starting with a client, and we will, and you can do these yourself as well, right? If you're updating your employee handbook or creating your handbook for the first time, asking people in advance, what are the HR policies, processes, and practices that you really like, and what don't you like, and what would you like to see that we've never thought of? And those kinds of focus groups can make a huge difference. Don't designate that though just for HR processes and policies. Oftentimes there are processes that we have in place in a company that go undetected. And so sometimes you might want to just look at, in general, what are our processes that are causing more challenges from an employee experience perspective than we would think. So keeping an open mind, but policy and process is often one of the reasons to do these. Some companies will do focus groups as just a general measure of employee engagement. There's a version of this that is just send out, like, here's our survey, finish our survey, and we get information. But we're going to talk about, one of the examples I'll give today is an approach where you marry the concept of surveys with focus groups to really get even more beneficial information along the way. And so measuring employee engagement and understanding what's really happening on a day-to-day basis is a key purpose of focus groups. And then actually, Catherine, this probably sounds familiar. This is this concept of, we've worked with clients to create what we call tips from the team for new hires, particularly if you are onboarding a lot of people, or it's an environment where, like, understanding the culture and the environment are really important and it's hard to integrate people. We have actually done focus groups with new hires to say, what does it feel like in those first 6 months? And getting that information from your new hires. So A, you understand, is our onboarding process working? But B, so that you can start to help your new hires feel like, oh, I'm not alone in how I'm feeling at month 3. Don't panic, can be really, really helpful. So we often will just even do focus groups just with new hires to get an understanding, or people maybe that are there 2 or 3 years, to get an understanding of, what did it feel like when I joined? And how can you take that and share it with new hires to say, here's things you should know you're probably going to feel. And when you do, please come and talk to us along the way. So it's a great tool that a lot of folks overlook in terms of pieces like that. So that's sort of why we do it. And there, again, I'm sure there's a million other reasons why companies do focus groups. The most important piece, though, is to get really clear up front. So oftentimes I will frame it in terms of, what is the problem you're trying to solve by doing a focus group. That way you're clear up front, because everything else we're going to talk about today kind of flows from that. What were we trying to accomplish? Because you need to think about, then, what is the structure of our focus group? How do we want to approach it? How do we want to divide people even into groups? All of that depends on the initial, what are we trying to accomplish? I'll use an example. A client a couple of weeks ago even was talking to us, and they were saying they recently had turnover of several female employees, and they typically don't have high turnover at all. So the fact that they had turnover was concerning, but add to it that any one of the people that they left were high performing female employees. And so the general manager asked us, he's like, I want to make sure we don't have something happening here that I haven't figured out that is causing it to be like, is it just a fluke that they all were female, or is there something happening in our environment that is creating that situation? How I'm going to organize that focus group is very different than if a client just says, you know what, in general, I want to understand how people feel about our benefits programs. So again, once you decide why you're doing it, then you can start to figure out all of the right answers as to how to do it. From a structure perspective, there's two versions that we often recommend for focus groups. Sometimes people will go with a large group version and like everybody's in the room together. And that can, depending on the size of the organization, that can be really problematic. So the first version that we like is kind of a small group setting. And when I say small group, it depends a little bit on your organization, but 5 to 10 people is ideal. You can ramp it up to about 15, depending on the organization and if they've ever done these before and if they've been successful. But 10 is really kind of an ideal top cap. You don't want to go smaller than 4 if you're going to do a group, because then it becomes everybody's looking at each other going, they're going to know who said what. And if you're going to do that, you should go with individual sessions. But 4 is kind of your minimum. Anything over the 10 mark, what you find is, particularly if in the organization trust is low, people will sit back and let the loudest voices talk because they're like, whoo, I just got through the focus group and I didn't have to say anything. So 10 gives you a chance for people to talk when they want to, but you can still control and facilitate it to make sure you're hearing from everyone. Also think about how you want to divide people. So if you can divide them by department, that is helpful. That sometimes will give you a read, again, depending on the problem you're trying to solve with the focus groups or the purpose of it. The by department can help you find out, do different departments have different lenses? So if you're worried about, are we being siloed or do people have different experiences, that can make a big difference. Sometimes I like this client that's trying to get at the genders piece specifically, we actually divided it by department, and then all of their female employees were in one department. So we actually like made sure that they were all in the same focus group and felt comfortable that if that was something that they could share. Now, we're not going to specifically say, hey, do you think it's a problem to work here as a female? But what we are going to do is we're using an open-ended question format, which we'll talk about in a minute. And we're going to watch to see, are the trends that come out of that conversation different than our trends that come out of their counterparts in those same departments? So really thinking through how you want to approach it matters. The second option for structure is individual interviews. And there are pros and cons to individual interviews. I ask a lot of questions before we go this route to make sure that it's the right choice. But individual interviews can be particularly helpful if you are trying to understand what's happening within a team, for example. So if I have folks that come and say like, wow, our teams just are not working well together, and I can't figure out what's at the root cause of it, then an individual interview is going to work really well because people feel like they can tell me anything and they don't have to worry that they've upset someone else. The other times that I will do it are things like, sometimes if I'm trying to get a read on how do people feel about our benefits or something like that, there's personal information that somebody may not want to share. And then the other piece is, depending on the organization, sometimes if I'm trying to get feedback on a specific leader, and we're trying to gauge how that leader is doing, then a one-on-one interview might make sense then as well, because again, they might be more comfortable telling me something and not having to worry about when it comes, how it's going to get back to someone. The key with individual interviews is, in particular, you have to make sure you've shored up for confidentiality. So you really have to work a little harder with individual interviews to make sure people know up front, what are you going to do to make sure that the feedback is anonymous and that they aren't at risk of it coming back to them. And so again, 2 different options. I have in a couple of cases used a hybrid version if there's like multiple purposes, or if group size makes a difference. Sometimes I'll pull out leaders as individuals and do the non-leadership roles together. So you can mix and match these, but the key is thinking about which of these structures is most beneficial based on the purpose of the focus group up front. Now, I will say sometimes clients go, well, I want a focus group because I want people to just feel like they can give feedback. That's not wrong. That's not bad. But what I suggest is like a purpose may be just to check in with people. But if you're going to do that, then there's ways to design the structure and the approach to it so people don't feel like, well, they didn't really know what they were doing. They just decided to ask me some questions. And so making sure that you've come up with a clear purpose once you get there. A couple of other reasons the individual interviews might be useful. If trust is low across a team, if somebody feels like, wow, if I say this in front of, use Nicole as example, if Nicole and I are in a focus group together and I say, hey, if Nicole heard me say this, she might go tell the boss, then individual interviews are definitely better. Sometimes if you're trying to gauge the consistency of an experience across a group of people. So for example, I've had clients where there's a rumbling or a murmur that, people are unhappy. Then what we'll do is, but everybody's like, but I can't tell if it's just like these three people or is it everybody? Like, what's really going on? Then we will use individual interviews as a way to make sure everybody has a consistent opportunity to voice and see what trends come out from the group. And then definitely in situations where we have some voices in our company, sometimes are louder than others, right? And in those situations, if the volume of one person's opinion might create a bandwagon effect, then we will sometimes say, you know what, let's do this individually and then compile the results. And obviously, if you're doing anything where it's feedback for the team, you need to make sure you make that happen. Sorry, losing my voice again. So those are some of the different approaches and structures. The challenge that we have sometimes we see from clients is they know they want focus groups, they know they want feedback, and their thought is like, let's either they're like, quick, let's give everybody a survey and see what happens, or quick, let's get everybody into a room and talk about it. And then when the approach doesn't align with what you were trying to accomplish, it unravels and people feel like you didn't take it seriously or that it wasn't constructive. And one of the challenges that comes with focus groups as a tool in the employee engagement tool belt is they have long memories. So if you do a focus group and it doesn't go well, so for example, right, you do a round of focus groups and the leader who was supposed to be getting the feedback gets mad about the feedback. It can take years before that team will be willing to participate again in a focus group. And that's why it's so important that you get this right, because even more so than a paper, like an online survey, focus groups are where people are making themselves vulnerable. So the minute you do one, it is like embedded in somebody's memory that they participated. And even if their confidentiality didn't get broken from that, if there's any perception that it had a negative impact to them at all, they will remember that for a very long time. And so putting this kind of thought and strategy into how you're going to do this makes a huge difference. Once we know the purpose and the structure of it, then we start thinking about how are we going to actually approach the conversations themselves. One, I mentioned that you can, like some companies will do, they won't do focus groups, but they'll do surveys. And there's some pros and cons to doing that. Sometimes the survey data is really helpful in and of itself, especially if you're talking about large employee populations or a pulse check between focus groups. But one of the ways that we like to, that sometimes can also be effective, because the problem with surveys is you get numerical data, but it's hard to get good commentary because people are nervous about like, well, what if they can tell from my writing, right? So they don't give as much like meaningful examples. You can't ask follow-up questions in a survey. You get one shot at it, right? So one of the approach options that you can do is you do a survey, but you tell people up front, we're going to do a survey to gather feedback at a high level, and then we're going to do focus groups to dive deep and really understand key takeaways from the survey data. If you take this approach, you want to tell people in advance that you're doing a two-step process, because otherwise they participate in the survey. And then when you go back and ask more questions, they're like, why did I bother writing something down if you were going to ask me more information anyway? So two-step process is the best way. Like if you do it, just communicate it up front. And then when you get into the focus groups, don't necessarily ask questions about every one of the survey questions. So for example, I have a client who we just did this with, and they had 10 survey questions that we sent out. And we found that there were three areas that were their strengths, and it was really like they weren't surprising. That's what we expected people to say. They were things the company had been working on and they were going well. We didn't really need more information there. There were three things that came back where we were like, yep, we knew people weren't happy about that. We're not surprised. We know what they're trying to tell us. Don't go ask people for feedback you already know, just fix it, right? But there were a couple of things from the middle of the results that we were like, interesting. I wonder what people are really getting at there. And like, I could go fix something, but it might be the wrong thing. And so those were the questions that we focused on in the focus group to really make sure we were solving the right problem. I'll use an example from my Progressive insurance days because it lives with me forever, probably because what ended up being the problem was part of my department. So it lives with you when you get told this. But we had a question. We had an annual employee survey that went out. And we had a question on the survey every year that was, I would refer a friend or colleague to Progressive. And it was intended to be a net promoter score kind of question. And the assumption was, if you liked working there and you liked the company culture, you would say yes, right? We never scored. We would get really high from lots of departments. We would get high scores in all of these categories, and then we would get a low net promoter score. And we were like, this doesn't make sense. And so one year, as part of the HR group, we put together a committee of folks and we went out and we did focus groups specifically around that question. And what was interesting is what we learned had nothing to do with what we expected. We went out and did focus groups fully expecting people to tell us, I might be okay with these things, but here's something about the culture that's really problematic, right? Or, something to do with their personal experience. What we heard in high volume and loud and clear was, oh no, I love working here, but our recruiting process doesn't treat my employee referrals well. So I won't refer people to apply because I don't want to hear about it if they don't get the job or they never hear from you. And we went, oh, we've been trying to solve the wrong problem. So needless to say, that feedback got back to us in the recruiting department very quickly, and we completely redesigned our employee referral process to address making sure that our employee referrals and our employees felt like they were treated with like literally white glove experience as they went through those processes. And so those surveys can be really helpful in those situations. You just have to plan for it in advance. The second approach that is that I really like, that is kind of an online hybrid version of the first and works really well, particularly if you have if you're doing these in remote settings, are using Zoom polls. So you do your focus group on Zoom, and I've done this even where the entire company is actually live and in person, but we did the focus group virtually. And because we wanted to be able to use this tool specifically. So the Zoom poll is literally, I set up the polls in advance in Zoom. I can pull the question up and everyone answers the same question at one time. I can't tell I can't tell who said what, but I can at least see how many people answered the question in that particular way, which then allows me to guide the conversation, right? If I ask a basic question like, I have trust in our senior leadership team, and everybody says strongly agree, I might ask some follow-up questions like, what are they doing that's really that really reinforces that and is a reason you would never want to change, right? Like something you don't want us to mess up because it's working really well. But we're only probably going to spend a minute or two talking about it. If I have of a group of 10, I have maybe 3 or 4 people who say strongly agree and a couple who are sort of neutral and a couple that are at like strongly disagree. We're going to spend a lot more time on that particular conversation. And more importantly, in addition to just the time, if the first 3 or 4 people that chime in go, oh no, it's fabulous and leadership is great and all of these things, I at least know not to take that as that's how everybody is feeling. And so I can say, great, I'm glad to hear that that's some of your experiences. For those of you, like, for other folks, like, what are the things that might feel differently from your perspective? That allows me to know I need to dig more to pull out information. The other piece it does is when you have that person in the room who is the loudest voice and they're sure everybody else agrees with them. And in fact, they probably think they're speaking on behalf of the whole world. Um, that's a perfect opportunity to say, you know what, Susie, that is such a great perspective. It's really helpful. I see from our polls that there might be other perspectives. Let's hear from some other folks. Why might people feel differently? And you can do it without saying, so if you said strongly disagree, please speak up now, but instead do it from the perspective of, if I didn't agree, what might be some of the reasons for that? And now you'll get engagement from everyone because the people who said disagree see I'm not the only one. It also works the opposite. If your loudest voice is the only person that feels that way, like everybody else is like, wait a minute, they were the only one that said, like, somebody said that, but everybody else feels really positively about this. So that kind of Zoom poll combination gives you a chance. I actually, when we do this for clients, we will actually track the results. So I'll keep track of how each of the questions scored. So I get a numeric sense, but I also get to real time ask those follow-up questions that we want to ask versus doing survey first, focus group second. The third option is to do a set of predefined questions. So this is really about, like, you might use either of the two first options of either a survey or a Zoom poll, but now you're at so what do I ask once I'm in the focus group, right? One of these versions is you go in with predefined questions. Things like, I receive timely and useful feedback. I have trust and confidence in the senior leadership team. I feel valued for my contributions. So very clear statements that are things you are wanting to find out about. This can work really well if there are 4 issues we need to solve. So it goes back to what is our purpose of the focus group. If you have a super clear purpose on, hey, we need to find out if people like our PTO policy or not, then these predefined questions work really well. The other option is going in with open-ended questions. And particularly when we're trying to design like a 1 to 3 or HR strategy, I will use this approach because I don't want to oversteer the conversation. So we will literally open up with, so you know what, as it relates to your experience as an employee, what's working really well? What would you like to see done differently or better, right? And depending on the organization, sometimes I can't say what's not working because people have, like, if they're not used to thinking about things not working, they're not comfortable with it. But open it wide open and then let the team dive where they want to. And again, particularly if you're looking for broader, like, you don't have I need to know about these 10 things, this approach works really well. The other opening question I often will use is, so from an employee experience perspective, what should this company start doing, stop doing, and continue doing? And we'll actually have, keep notes in those 3 categories so we can go back to the leadership team and say, all right, here's what people are like, here's what people like. Don't mess this stuff up. Here's the things that they'd love to see done, like, that aren't happening today that they would like to see. And here's things that are happening that are causing issues and we need to change completely. So 2 different approaches once you decide how you want to go about getting the feedback, 2 different ways to go about it. The predefined questions, again, I find if it's an organization where trust is low around focus groups or surveys in general, I will typically go in with the predefined questions because I'm giving somebody, like, I'm giving them a topic and I usually will also use the Zoom polls for it. I'm giving you a topic, I'm allowing you to weigh in anonymously, and then we're steering the conversation. What that allows for is when I go back to leaders and say, here's what we heard in the focus groups, I can say, look, we asked these questions and here's what they told us about these topics, which sometimes will resonate better for leaders because they're like, people have been sitting around worrying about that. And it's like, no, I asked, they answered. So if trust around the process is low, then your predefined questions sometimes can help buffer that much more easily. If you have a whole team of people who have never been through a focus group before and they don't have any idea how to interact in that space, or they're freaked out by the concept, you definitely want to go with predefined questions because you will get crickets when it comes to open-ended questions. So some of it is knowing the nature of the organization and how used to giving feedback they are. Also, there are cultural differences here. So for example, a lot of our clients have large employee populations in the Hispanic community. If you go into that setting and strictly say, so what's working and what's not working? You will either hear crickets, you might hear the what's working, you will likely not hear the what's not working without really digging in. So even if you start high level to get them comfortable with the what's working and get them talking, culturally they are not, many folks will tell you that, especially our folks that are here on like visa programs and so forth, what we find is culturally participate in a focus group and give feedback is rocking the boat, which does not feel comfortable to them. And they're very uncertain as to how it's going to be used. And so no matter how much you talk about it, you need to have that. I would go predefined questions and I would go with polls as a way to gather that feedback, or I would do a survey in advance where they can answer knowing it's completely anonymous, and then ask for follow-up along the way. But again, I just keep that cultural piece in mind as you go through. Right. So that's some of the different approaches to consider and things that you will find make a huge difference. Remember, your goal is to reassure people we want to hear from you, right? This is valuable to us. You are part of making us better. So your communication before the focus group becomes really critical. So when we think about best practices, if you're going to do a focus group, you can't just say, hey, by the way, there's a focus group on Friday at 10 o'clock. That is not going to get you what you want. You have to be really planful and mindful of how are we communicating this? What are we communicating? How do we reinforce and reassure people that this is going to be a positive outcome? Now, again, some company cultures, if it's always been a part of your company culture to give feedback all the time and share information and all of these things, then you don't have to spend as much time in the space. You still always have to reinforce it, but you don't have to spend as much time. If you've never done this, or you've done a focus group before and it didn't go well, all of those things, like this becomes really critical and probably needs to be communicated multiple times with a clear plan and a really well thought out approach to communication up front. The number one thing you want to make sure you communicate to people is why. Why are you doing a focus group? Particularly if you've never done one, they're like, did something go wrong? Is somebody mad? Are we in trouble? Like people, if you've never done one before, people's brains go to really weird spaces. So what's the need? Did you just, like, if we're doing them, if it's a new client on the HR side and we're doing them because we're building the HR strategy, then we absolutely come at it from a perspective of, hey, the new consultant is coming in, they're going to build our employee practices and our handbook, and they want to hear from you. What should they be thinking about while they're doing this? We took a client through a merger, so two businesses coming together, and we had to line up all of their policies, and they were not even close to one another. So we did focus groups with each of the groups to say, like, what's most concerning to you as we bring these employee experiences together? We didn't go out and say, well, which of these two policies do you want? But by doing the focus groups, what it actually gave us more than anything was a little bit of insight into where people were going to be most passionate, so we could ruffle the fewest number of feathers. But it also was critical because we knew we weren't going to make everybody happy with new policies. So we at least knew when it came time to roll out the final policies, this one is going to be super ugly. Like, people are going to hate this one. So it gave us the information to have a more robust communication plan at the end when we couldn't meet something that mattered to them. But there was a reason why. We at least realized we were poking the bear and we needed to be really familiar. Like, we had to think about how we were going to communicate that. So make sure you're clear on like what created the need. What are you hoping to accomplish? Again, if people show up to a focus group and they're like, I don't know, I was just told to be here, you're not going to get out of it what you want. And also, they might go in going, oh, great, they're going to change their benefits plan. And this is the year you're like, we're not changing benefits. I want to know about whether or not, like, do we need new leaders, like leadership development training, or do we need this other thing? So making sure that people have expectations set in advance. Also making sure they understand how will the information be used and what will get communicated back to leadership teams. So for example, when we do these, we were really clear to employees. The focus group will happen. We will identify trends in the conversation. So if something only comes up once, it's not going to get shared back, obviously, unless it reaches the level of like harassment, discrimination, somebody feels unsafe. But for the most part, it has to come up as a trend. We also talk about the fact that what will happen after the focus group is we will put together a summary of those trends, share it back with the employees for them to review before it goes to the leadership team, so that they know going into that meeting, we're going to make sure that this goes well and that everybody is safe. And again, remember, even if focus groups at your company have always gone really well, people come with all sorts of baggage around these things. And so if you've been in an environment where somebody said something once in a focus group and suddenly that person disappeared the next day, you might be that new hire's like, I'm not gonna say anything, which is not what you want to happen. So up front, the why and the what's going to happen is an important part of the communication. And you've got to be, can't assume that just because your intentions are pure and good, that people will automatically make that assumption. The next piece is in best practices, and this is a absolute must. You have to ensure confidentiality. Whether somebody internal is doing the focus group or you are using a third party, you 100% need to recognize that the only way people will continue to give you feedback is if you take good care of them when they participate the way you want them to. And so you have to hold your third parties accountable for doing this really, really well and not ever breaking those rules. So report only trends. Don't ever say, like, even examples. My rule of thumb is you don't share an example unless there were so many people in the room that saw what happened that there would be no way to know who did what. I had that happen one time. I kept having the same example come up in my focus groups. And it was a situation where somebody said something horribly inappropriate in front of a large group of, they kept saying in a meeting, this person said, and what they said was wildly inappropriate. And I finally, after I heard it 3 or 4 times, I said, can you tell me what meeting was that? I was very, very upfront and said, I've heard that exact example 3 times now. I would love to be able to share it, but I want to make sure that it's a broad enough setting that, like, I wouldn't be pinning down a department or whatever. And they're like, oh no, it was a all company meeting and they said it. And I was like, great, I can use that. If it's in a department meeting with 3 people, I can't, because now somebody's going to know, though it had to be one of those 3 people. And so you need to think about things like that. I will say, you can do focus groups internally, particularly if you have somebody on your team that is really trusted in this space and has that, like, and also depending on the topic, right? There are some topics, if you're talking about an operational process that happens every day. You know, if you need input on like, what's it like to submit expense reports, probably doesn't need to be super confidential, right? Probably can be done internally. If you're talking about how is a leader doing, or how are we feeling about the leadership team as a whole, even to some extent, things like, you know, what's the general day-to-day, what do we feel about our policies kind of stuff. There are some things that people just won't open up enough to somebody internal. If you're doing a broader perspective of like, people are crabby and we don't know why, you definitely want to use that opportunity to leverage somebody from the outside. You will hear things that you would never hear internally, if you allow for that. We had a client that, like, the HR group is the group that hired us to do the focus groups, and we got halfway through focus groups and learned that a lot of the feedback was coming from, they were having negative interactions with the HR group. They never would have learned that, and they were unintentional things that the HR team clearly did not intend for it to happen, but their HR team would have missed out on that feedback because nobody would have said that, and they never would have gotten to the root cause of some of the problem. And the other piece is making sure that you prep the leadership team, anybody who's getting the feedback. We need to keep people from guessing who shared what, right? We just had, this is one of the impetuses for this particular presentation, actually was a client who did focus groups, was sure that Susie was the person who gave all of this feedback in the focus group. In fact, Susie had not. In fact, Susie was like, she actually didn't participate at all, come to find out, because she was worried this was happening. So she was there, but she said nothing the entire time. And the owner went back to Susie after getting the feedback and like absolutely berated her for sharing the feedback and told her that it was inappropriate. You cannot guess, because you're probably going to be wrong. And even if you're right, what it says to everyone else, needless to say, Susie's upset, right? But everyone else will feel like, oh, shoot, did I say anything that's going to come back to haunt me? And they will never participate. Like, literally, it will take you probably 5 years to recover from that and be able to do a focus group again. So it's really important that we coach our leadership teams the right way. And then most importantly, say thank you. So after focus groups are up, you want to say thank you. You want to mean it. You want to take action quickly. Thank you so much for participating. We got a ton of value from the feedback. Here is when you will hear our summary of what steps we're taking as a result and the timelines for those actions, so that people know they were heard. Something will happen, even if it can't happen overnight, but something will happen and they will know what's going to happen. Share timelines. If there's a long tail, some things are low hanging fruit. Sometimes you need a longer tail. It's fine. Just tell people what you can do. And sometimes if it's something you can't fix, at least acknowledge it. Thank you so much. We heard you loud and clear that this is an issue. It's not like, we don't necessarily think you're wrong. Right now, we just can't address that. And here's some background as to why we've made that decision not to address it now, but know that we will continue to look for future solutions. So again, we appreciate you, and you were heard is the key message that you want people to hear. And they can't just see the words, they have to feel that from everybody that was impacted by the focus group. So I'm only going to spend a little time on the destructive behaviors, because I hope these are the no-brainer ones, right? But there are some things that, like I say, it can take 3 to 5 years to recover from any one of these disastrous outcomes from a focus group. But you got to make sure, we can't take for granted that, like, we all go, well, of course I wouldn't do that, because focus groups, depending on the feedback, can be really personal. The first one is, you cannot have people feeling like they were retaliated against, or that you voice frustration about the feedback. So sometimes we'll have somebody who gets feedback and they're like, well, that one's just dumb. Well, you know what? If you say that outside of this room with me, you're going to lose this team. And you know what? It might be something that's not super relevant to the, to the bigger picture, but you never say it was dumb. You never say you were frustrated. And you've got to make sure that nobody feels like they are thought less of because they participated. You don't want to diminish the value of the feedback. And sometimes this will even just sound like, we did that focus group and we already knew everything you told us. Even if you did, when you tell somebody that, you're basically saying, well, I already knew this wasn't working well, but I didn't do anything about it anyway. So like now I really don't care. So it is super important that people go, you know what? Thank you so much for the feedback. Well, some of it is things that we were kind of aware of. It was great to put it in that context to really realize and recognize the impact that it's having. We're going to raise that up on the priority list, or we're not going to be able to raise it up on the priority list. But please know we do hear you and we'd love to continue to figure out how we can address this, right? But don't diminish the value of it. Failure to take action. This is probably the most common. We all know not to go back and be like, you spoke up in the focus group and now I'm going to fire you. We know that's a bad plan, right? But sometimes we get focus group feedback and then we've already moved on to something else. Or, you know what, by the time I've had clients where it takes us 4 months to get through all the focus group because of the number of people. And so if you were in the first group, you feel like, well, whatever happened with that? And, or something major has changed in the meantime. And I've seen organizations be like, ooh, but that's not really relevant now because the leader has changed or whatever. Take some action. There's always something that can happen. And you need to make sure that that happens and that you're talking about it loudly so that people know. Delays in reporting back. It has to be a quick process. People expect that when they get on and they talk about something, whether it be on Zoom or be in person, they expect that when they do it, they're going to at least hear how the leader reacted to it. And even if the leader doesn't react well, you don't say that to people. You say things like, you know what, this is a lot to process, but we've got some good ideas. And here's when we're going to have a plan back for you. But don't let that be too long. The breach of confidentiality we talked about, and avoid, if you avoid accountability. So as the individual receiving the feedback, whether that be an entire leadership team, whether that be one individual, the minute we start saying things like, well, I hear your feedback, but I can't do anything about that. Progressive used to get this a lot. One of the questions we asked on our surveys was around how people felt about compensations and compensation plans, and managers would get their feedback and it might not be great in that space. So they're like, well, thank you for participating in that question, but I don't have any control over that. Even if that's true, that is not helpful in your approach to things. Instead, you say things like, you know what, thank you so much for that feedback. That's a larger organizational structure issue we need to address. But we've heard this loud and clear enough that here's what we're going to do to elevate this to make sure that we follow through on it. Here's what we're going to do to learn more about what control I can have, what difference I can have as a manager. But there has to be some accountability for reporting back, telling people what you're doing, pointing out that like we did this because of your feedback. And when you do focus groups, the more frequently you use those words in the year following a focus group, the more likely you are to get even more useful feedback from future focus groups. This is kind of a key mantra of thank you so much for that feedback. And oh, that thing we just changed, do you remember that came from our focus group a year ago? We'll absolutely have people over the moon. Even if it took a year to fix it, they at least know you remembered that that's where it came from. Those give you kind of the do's and don'ts of focus groups. They are, I go back to where I started, right? They are the most powerful tool you have in your toolbox from an employee engagement perspective. And when done well, organizations who do these really, really well absolutely outperform other organizations because they create an environment where people are always thinking about, hey, what can we do better? And hey, maybe I could make a suggestion to make that happen. And they say, it says to people, we care. And it says to people, we as leaders are vulnerable too, and we're willing to take feedback. We're willing to be coached. And so all of those things make a huge difference. But you have to do each part of this really well to make that effective. And it starts with understanding why are you doing the focus group and what are you hoping to get from it? Then thinking about the how do you do it? What's the best way to get to that why? And then you make sure you have a really well communicated and executed process so that when people get done, they're like, wow, I've done this other places and it didn't feel like this. And they're excited, that much more excited to participate going forward. We'll we'll take us off of recording here in just a moment, just as a reminder that one of the things we always share at the end of our webinars for those that attend, at any point, if you would like to take advantage of our free HR strategy session, essentially it's free time with me to sit down and really talk about whether it's specifically you're thinking about a focus group and you'd like some help in like figuring out some of those right questions, or if it's sitting down and thinking about how do we approach what's going on in your organization and how do we approach the like 1 to 3 year HR strategy for what do you need to do to really make sure that your HR world is aligning with your business strategies. We offer that to you. All you have to do is email us at hr@peoplesolutionscenter.com, and Nicole will take great care of getting you on my calendar so we can have those conversations. So never forget that piece of it. We'll go ahead, Nicole, if you don't mind hitting the record button for me.